Okay, so we're going to start chapter 3. And in chapter 3, you might say the main character who arises now is Haman. By the way, there's an interesting discussion I found in Wikipedia. They mention a lot of things. Who is Haman? I don't know if you can see this. Oh, let me show this to you on share screen. Can you see it? Hold on. The etymology and the meaning of the name, because remember, there's a lot of, I said in the past, there are a lot of motifs from the Persian period in the Book of Esther. So there's really no reason to doubt that the Book of Esther is from the Persian period. It's true that there's some of the historians try to push it off later into the Hasmonean period, but they don't have enough good reason to do so. The only question is it the beginning of the Persian period, the end of the Persian period? That's something you could argue. There's also an argument about who Achashverosh was. Was he Xerxes? Was he Artaxerxes the first or Artaxerxes the second? This is also a discussion. And then, of course, the old question of whether this is a fictional story which takes place in real-time Persia, or a real story which has been slightly manipulated in order to make a point. My personal feeling would be more number 2, for the simple reason that the Tanakh itself does that a lot. It will take a real story, and the narrative of the story will be according to what it wants us to know, not necessarily as Professor Hare from Hebrew University once said, the Bible is not interested so much, or he even says the same thing about the Talmud, is less interested in historiographia and more interested in historiosophia. In other words, not that interested in getting all the details correct. That's not the point. It's more interested in what you can learn from history. So in the narrative already will be ideas of what you can learn within the story itself. Something which I think for the modern mind is hard to comprehend, but for the ancient mind makes a lot of sense. Remember, history as historiography only starts really with the Greeks. Before that, ancient people didn't have that need, I guess, to make sense of history the way we like doing it today. They were more interested, I guess, in the symbols and the meanings of the historical events that took place than every detail which might have happened, and which happened first and which happened second. But even in the Bible, Rashi claims Ein mukdam u'muchar b'Torah, that very often the Torah writes out of sequence, because it's trying to make a point much more than it's trying to give across the history. Take, for instance, what we're about to read, Parshat Kitisa, which is coming up soon, and Parshat Kitisa, which talks about the sin of the golden calf, and it's put in between the 2 parshiot of the commands of building the tabernacle and the 2 parshiot which talks about the execution of building the tabernacle. Even though everybody knows that the sin of the golden calf happened before, when we heard the Decalogue, 40 days after the Decalogue. So it really should have been in Parshat Yitro. So Rashi will say, the Torah doesn't necessarily give things in sequence. And of course, you can understand that metaphorically, the idea of the sin of the golden calf, where the Israelites are interested in something tangible in order to worship God, becomes now the reason for the building of the Mishkan, or the tabernacle, which is a tangible edifice in which they can now pray to God. You might say it's almost like God is giving into their needs by building the tabernacle. In other words, you need something tangible, I'll tell you how to do it, and this is okay, but not a golden calf. And so the golden calf then becomes right in the middle of these 4 parshiot, almost to say that one was the cause or the need of the other, created the need for the other. So getting back to Haman, if Haman, of course, is a Persian leader of sorts, the question is, the name Haman, where does it come from? There's a bit of a discussion here, as you can see, about the etymology of the name. Some people say it's from an old Persian word, which means the illustrious, the magnificent, which I guess would make sense. Others say that there's even argument that Haman is actually a priestly title and not even a proper name. And so all these, of course, are possibilities, but they're the type of things that you have to try to go into and figure it out. It's interesting that Haman is mentioned in the Quran in 6 places, and each time he seems to be somebody who is a high priest to Pharaoh. In general, in the Quran, there's a little bit of mixing up historically with names of people. Okay. And interestingly enough, in the Septuagint, Haman is actually referred to as a Macedonian, which could be a corruption of a Mede, because remember, you have Paras Umadai, and the Medes were a nation underneath the Persians. But the idea of the Macedonian also means that he came in from the outside, which would tie in very well with the story, because remember, at the end of the story, after the second banquet with Esther, Achashverosh starts to suspect Haman of being a spy, meaning somebody who's trying to undermine and not faithful to the empire. So all these are interesting things too. And another interesting discussion here in the Vulgata, which seems to talk about the hanging of Haman and seems to imply it might have been a crucifixion, again, connecting later things with earlier things. I just wanted to show that to you. Let's go back to the book of Esther. Oops, wrong one. Sorry about that. It is this one. Okay, so as I said, sometime afterward, King Achashverosh promoted Haman, the son of Hamdata, the Agagite. Now, there is a Midrash which relates Haman all the way up to Amalek, which of course is the grandson of Esav. Esav has a son whose name is Eliphaz. Eliphaz marries a concubine by the name of Timnah, and they have a child whose name is Amalek. And this Amalek, of course, which we just read about in Shabbat Zachor last Shabbat, becomes really, you might say, the antagonistic or the nemesis of the Jewish people over the generations, this Amalek. The Midrash brings an unusual story about this Timnah, that supposedly she came from royal background, and she wanted actually to marry into Abraham's family. She wanted to marry into Isaac, if possible, but Abraham rejected her, thinking that she wasn't a sincere convert, so Esav took her instead. And because of this, her son Amalek becomes the nemesis of the Jewish people, because we didn't treat the mother the way it should have been treated, which is an interesting midrash, which is also, you might say, it's almost like a warning to take, even though in Jewish law, we're supposed to say 3 times no to converts, but that doesn't mean we're not supposed to take them seriously. And I guess when you make a mistake with somebody who is supposed to be converted, it's also a problem, according to the Midrash, even though obviously Yitzchak or Abraham, whoever rejected her, probably it was not out of bad intention. So this is also an interesting story. So sometime after this, King Achashverosh promotes Haman, the son of Hamdata, the Agagite, and then of course the Talmud tries to make the connection between this Agag and the king Agag, who was slayed by Samuel, even though we're talking about many generations later. So there would be, you would have to say that this Agag is named after that Agag, because chronologically it doesn't work unless there are a whole bunch of generations in the middle between this fellow and between Hamdata and Agag. But then again, it might be just an idea. Even though there is a midrash which tries to tie Haman all the like, it could also be an idea and not necessarily. But there seems to be some argument that maybe Haman was not Persian, did come from the outside, as was mentioned, as I said, by the Septuagint. In general, it's not unusual in history that a leader comes from the outside and comes to power, both good leaders and bad leaders. And we've had plenty of bad leaders who use their vision from coming from the outside to take over. I mean, I don't have to give you examples from the 20th century, they're quite obvious. Hitler, who was from Austria and was able to take over Germany, or take Joseph Stalin, who was from Georgia and took over Russia, or for instance, Napoleon, who was from Italy, I think from Corfu. Remind me, Jonathan, what island he was from? Was it Corfu? I can't hear you, you're on mute.
Ithaca, I think. Yep.
And I'm sorry?
Ithaca, I think.
Okay, I thought maybe Corfu, it doesn't matter, but he was from an Italian region, and of course he takes over France. So very often, both for the good or for the bad, leadership can sometimes be a person who has a different vantage point because of the fact that they didn't grow up in the same place as everybody else. In fact, even in our own tradition, Moses, of course, is an Israelite. By growing up, however, in the Egyptian palace, he is able to see things which the Israelite slaves are not able to see. He's able to see the world from a different vantage point than they do. So, as I said, at this point, after the assassination plot against Achashverosh in chapter 2, by Bigtan V'Teresh, where Mordechai informs the king about what happened, about what they were planning to do, and it turned out that this was true, Achashverosh now becomes the dictator. He now never leaves his palace. He puts Haman instead. Haman is sort of like the double going around waving in the car. And he, of course, instead of having an exact double, it's just another person. But he, being the vizier, the second to the king, the emperor's emperor, I don't know, the vice emperor, whatever it might be called, sort of like the Joseph story with Pharaoh. So, by the way, that's probably why the Quran gets mixed up between Haman and Joseph and says Haman was a priest of Pharaoh, because Joseph really also was a second to the king, just like Haman was. So probably this was the reason why it got a little bit mixed up. All the king courtiers in the palace knelt and bowed low to Haman, for such were the king's orders concerning him. But Mordechai, lo yichra v'lo yishtachaveh, would not bow down and would not bow low. Now, the Talmud makes this more dramatic and say that Haman actually walked around with a little idol that he wore around his neck. But even if he didn't have an idol, this idea, he idolized himself, right? He was a very arrogant person, which many politicians are. And he liked the idea that everybody kneeling to him. The Maharal of Prague points out, it says Mordechai, it didn't say Mordechai did not kneel. It says Mordechai would not kneel. So the way the Maharal explains this is like this. In other words, he was actively making sure that Haman understood that he would not kneel. So for instance, if Mordechai was walking on one side of the street and Haman was walking on the other side of the street, Mordechai would cross the street to the same sidewalk as Haman and pass by him without kneeling, just to make the point. Maharal explains Mordechai would not kneel or bow and not did not kneel or bow. In other words, it was an active, you might say, way of protesting this concept of having somebody bow to the king's second in command. Then the king courtiers who were in the palace gate said to Mordechai, "Why do you disobey the king's order?" Because remember, the king allowed Haman to tell people to kneel. And they spoke to him day after day, and Mordechai wouldn't listen. Again, you can see that the Maharal is correct about this. Mordechai understood, but I don't do these things. You know, this is a definite protest. And they told Haman in order to see what Mordechai's resolve would prevail. They thought it was cute. Here there's this one guy who's a bit of an aristocrat, and he differs with Haman. Let's see who's going to win. For he explained to them that he was a Jew. Okay? It seems that always being a Jew is never a part of word. I remember the first time I was in Poland, so a Polish-born friend of mine told me that in Poland, the word Jew is not a neutral word. You either like the Jews or you hate the Jews, but it's not a neutral word. There are countries, I think most Jews aspire outside of Israel to live in a country where Jew is a neutral word where nobody cares. And that would be, for most Jews, would be an achievement. And yeah, I remember the story one time of this fellow in the Canadian Jewish News who had moved to Montreal from France. And they asked him, how are your feelings now that you're in Montreal? And he told the story, you know what? I started my employment a month ago, and lunchtime I was talking with a colleague, and somehow while I was talking, I mentioned that I was Jewish, and I was shocked that he didn't stop the conversation to say anything. He just continued as if I didn't say anything of significance. He said if that would have been in France and I would have said I'm Jewish, they would have stopped the conversation and said something like, you don't look it, I never knew. It would be like something, but just to go on naturally in the conversation and it, as if nothing happened, he said, I was shocked to see that when I was in Montreal. So for many Jews, that's of course is an achievement. But as you can see, already in the Persian Empire, he explained to him he was a Jew, and this, at least according to the narrative of the Megillah, this seems to be something which they want to see how it's going to make its way, how it's going to play through. When Haman saw that Mordechai would not kneel to or bow to him, Haman was filled with rage. Now, was this because they told him or because Haman noticed it? Not clear. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordechai alone, being told that Mordechai's people were. Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews, Mordechai's people, throughout the kingdom of Achashverosh. In other words, it was beneath him to talk to Mordechai now that he knew that he was a Jew. Now, this is interesting, because we always think of anti-Semitism as being a phenomena which is post-Second Temple period. There is a question, when we think about the history of anti-Semitism, I think a lot of people see the history of anti-Semitism starting maybe with the church, who saw themselves as the real Israel, and the Jews now being the ones who were the Antichrist, or the ones who did not accept the Messiah and turned away. And now sort of like the two figurines at the entrance of the famous cathedral in Strasbourg, where you have ecclesia and synagoga representing the synagogue, ecclesia representing the church, and synagoga has a blindfold over her eyes and her staff of monarchy is broken, whereas you can see that, and she's looking downwards, but ecclesia is looking forwards and she sees the light and she's now in control. So very often we think at that period of being the beginning of anti-Semitism. Others argue that the first century already, you had, of course, Appian, because Josephus writes a whole book contra Appionum, against Appian, who is an Egyptian, who is very anti-Jewish, it appears. And this is after the destruction of the temple. So some people see Appian as one of the early anti-Semites in our history. But according to the narrative of the Megillah, it seems that Haman already had a problem with the Jews in general, not just with Mordechai, who did not want to bow down to him. And then the question is why? Which is interesting, because in Christianity, we can give a reason for it. In the Megillah, it's not clear. Why exactly? And the Megillah doesn't explain. It sort of gives it as a given. So when you read the Megillah, based on our history for the last 2,000 years, it seems obvious. But when you think of the fact that it's written more than 2,000 years ago, it's an interesting question. Like, what really is the origin of anti-Semitism? Wasn't it just anti-people from Judea or anti-Israelite? Was it really anti-Semitism? That Mordechai. So this is an interesting question, because remember, under the Persians, there are 128 provinces, and there are many different cultures and religions. So even the Persians themselves, despite the fact that there were Zoroastrians, they incorporated the Babylonian gods into them too, like Marduk, which is a Babylonian god. And before that was an Assyrian god, by the way. So they're quite eclectic in their cultural way of thinking. And this is something that even after them, the the Ptolemies and the Seleucids that were acted the same way. So it's interesting that you have a guy like Haman, who seems to be a very early anti-Semite historically. Anyhow, in the first month, the month of Nisan, again, all these names of months are Babylonian names. And this, by the way, is the first place in the Bible where Babylonian names are used for the months of the year. Before that, in the Torah, the months of the year are called the first month, the second month, the third month, the fourth month, up to the 12th month. However, you will find in the book of Kings, Hebrew names for some of the months. You will find Yerach HaEitanim, which is the old Hebrew name for Tishrei. You'll find Bul, which I don't even remember which month that is, but very few. There are like 2 or 3 mentioned in the book of Kings. Whereas at this point, the Babylonian months, which were used, incorporated into the Persian society, because that's what the people used under the Babylonian rule, these become also our months eventually, what we call today the Hebrew months, which are just our way of pronouncing the Babylonian months. And the Talmud already says why. The Talmud says says that it was Ezra who had the idea of incorporating the Babylonian months into our culture, so that we should never forget the Babylonian exile. The Talmud says that specifically. So he cast lots. By the way, it's a Persian word for lots, which is pur, and that's why we call the holiday Purim, which means lots, which were cast before Haman. The Talmud says that Haman was an astrologer. So this idea of casting lots and seeing what fate will come out also seems to be interestingly related to the way the Talmud understands Haman. And it fell on the 12th month with the month of Adar. And the Talmud says when it fell on the month of Adar, Haman realized this is a good month, because this is the month that Moses died, on the 7th day of Adar. But the Talmud says that he didn't realize that Moses was also born on the 7th day of Adar. In general, we say that righteous people are both born and die on the same day. They say the same thing about King David, who was born and died on Shavuot, the 6th of Sivan. So Moses also says he was born and died on the 7th of Adar. So Haman thought that was a bad day for the Jews, but actually it was a good day for the Jews. And in general, today after the Purim event, we say in general that Adar is a very good month for the Jews. And therefore, if you have a court case with a non-Jew, the Talmud says, make sure it falls in Adar, that gives you the upper hand. But if it falls in the month of Av, try to get out of it, push it off. So the Talmud also has a certain concept about times of the year, not exactly relating to the stars, even though the Talmud seems to have accepted the popular belief of astrology, which was quite universal in their time, but also has a concept of events that affect the particular months and days of the year. Haman says to Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among all the peoples in your provinces and your realm, whose laws are different than other peoples. By the way, the Hebrew word for laws is dat, datehem. In modern Hebrew, the word dat is used for religion, but the truth is the word dat, which seems to be a Persian root of word, it actually means laws. There is no actually Hebrew word for the word religion, because the concept of religion, the way it's understood in the West, is really a modern concept. So, whose laws are different from other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. And it's not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. If it pleases your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction. I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the stewards for the deposit in the royal treasury. So the king removed his signet from his hand, gave it to Haman of Amdata, the foe of the Jews. Now, when you look at this, would you say that the king is also an anti-Semite, like Haman?
Can't say that.
Why?
He's just reacting to a rebellion as it is presented to him.
Right. At least according to the narrative, the king doesn't even ask who it was. It's almost like if it was a movie, I would think that the king would have said to Haman, Haman, your job is to keep me in this throne. Do whatever you have to do. You don't even have to ask me. So you want me to sign? I'll sign. And something like that. It's true. Achashverosh does not seem to be an anti-Semite. He does not seem to have a problem with the Jews. The Talmud, though, describes Achashverosh very differently. The Talmud in Megillah says that he brought out the vessels of the temple to say, here, the Jews were supposed to go back to Jerusalem. It's not going to happen. So the Talmud actually turns Achashverosh into an anti-Zionist, if you want to put it that way, because remember, Cyrus already told the Jews that they could go back to the land of Israel. And there is one of the Achashveroshes which is against, in the book of Daniel, of the Jews going back. It's not clear which one. Let's assume this was the one according to the Talmud. But again, under Ezra, they do go back eventually, whether under Xerxes or Artaxerxes the first or Artaxerxes the second. So the Talmud seems to paint this particular Achashverosh as not necessarily being anti-Jewish, but anti the idea of the Jews going back to Zion, which would give them political power. But from the narrative of the book of Esther, this is not clear at all. And Haman seems to be anti-Jewish, not Achashverosh. So there's also, the Talmud says that the shkalim, the half shekel that we paid to the Mishkan every year into the temple, that saved us from the 2,000 shkalim of Haman, from the 10,000 shkalim of Haman. In other words, they try to tie in, and that's why another reason why we have of course, the half shekel, which was given normally at the beginning of Adar. Okay, and the king said, the money and the people are yours to do as you see fit. In other words, I don't need the money. Haman, you're doing your job. That's okay. Just do it. So on the 13th day of the first month, meaning the month of Nisan, the king's scribes were summoned and a decree was issued. And Haman directed to the king's satraps, to the governors of the provinces, to the officials of every people, to every province in its own script, to every people in his language. The orders were issued in the name of the king Achashverosh and sealed with the king's signet. By the way, in Persian law, the satraps as well as the kings always have advisors. If you remember in chapter 1, the advisors of the king, this was a sort of like the way that normally the courts were set up, not only of the king, but also of the governors. Another thing that in chapter 1 reflects the Persian Empire. But another interesting thing is also that we know from the Persian Empire that royal edicts were not allowed to be canceled by the king. If you remember later on in the Megillah, when Esther and Mordechai want the king to abolish the 13th of Nisan as the day when people can fight the Jews, the king said, unfortunately, I can't do that. I can write another one, but I cannot cancel the first one. And we know for a fact, historically, this was part of the legal thinking in the Persian Empire. So it's another samaman, we would say in Hebrew. It's another description of these events taking place in the Persian Empire. Accordingly, written instructions were dispatched to all the couriers of the king's provinces to destroy, massacre, and exterminate the Jews, young and old. This is quite dramatic. On the one single day, on the 13th day of the 12th of Adar, to plunder their possessions. The text of the document was to the effect that the law should be proclaimed in every province. It was publicly displayed to the peoples that they may be ready for that day. What was this? What type of day was this? This was like a Kristallnacht, where the police were going to stand down. Unfortunately, it was a little bit like the riots in Manhattan, which happened not too many months ago, where the police were told to stand down and let the rioters do whatever they want to do. And so in this particular case, it's not just destroying businesses, it's destroying people. And the police basically are not allowed to do anything. They have to stand down. It's a royal edict. So, and what is the incentive of these people to do that? Because remember, not everybody wants to kill people for no reason. They can plunder their possessions. Okay, so this edict is giving people incentive to do it because they can take their houses, they can take their wealth, they can whatever. And remember, the Jews probably don't have real weapons. I'm assuming to have a real weapon, like in many empires, you have to have a license. Like today, you need a license to have a gun. Probably in those days, you might have needed a license to have a sword, to have a dagger of a certain length. By the way, in Israeli law, having a dagger of a certain length, although you have to have a permit for it. Of course, you have a lot of, Bedouins sort of like keep it under their clothes, so you can't always see it. But I'm just saying that officially, certain things need, certain, you have to have a license to carry such things, a knife of a certain length, etc. In Canada, I think a switchblade also, you need a special permission, things like that. Okay. The text of the document was to the effect that a law should be proclaimed in every province. It was publicly displayed to all the peoples. They should be ready for that day. Okay? Haman is doing very cleverly. The police don't have to do the dirty work. There's enough incentive for people who maybe don't like the Jews, and secondly, maybe they don't care about the Jews, but they want the property. And you always have people like that. The couriers went out on the royal mission. The decree was proclaimed in the fortress of Shushan, or the capital Shushan, and the king and Haman sat down to a feast, and the city of Shushan was Navocha, which means perplexed. Chapter 4. Mordechai learned what had happened. Mordechai tore his clothes, he rent his garments, put on a sackcloth, and went to the city crying loudly, until he came in front of the palace, and he could not enter the palace with sackcloth. And in every province the king's command had reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, fasting, weeping, and wailing. And everybody had sackcloth and ashes. And Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and informed her, and the queen was greatly agitated. By the way, the Talmud says that the eunuch that came to see Mordechai, his name was Daniel, the prophet Daniel. So they tried to make this connection also. She sent clothing for Mordechai to wear so that he might take off a sackcloth, but he refused. And Esther summoned the Tach, one of the eunuchs of the king, and sent him to Mordechai to learn why and wherefore, what's going on. And the Tach went to Mordechai in the city square, found him at the palace gate, and Mordechai told him what had happened about the money that Haman offered to pay. But in the end, even that was turned down by the king. But Mordechai knows every detail. He also gave him the written text of the law that had been proclaimed in Shushan for the destruction, which was shown to Esther to inform her and charge her to go to the king to appeal to him and to plead with him. And the Tach came and delivered Mordechai's message to Esther. Mordechai told the Tach to tell Mordechai, Esther, all the king's courtiers in the king's provinces know that if a man or a woman enters the king's presence in the inner courtyard without being summoned, the law is that that person must be put to death, unless the king extends the golden scepter. Now, I have not been summoned for the last 30 days to the king. And Mordechai says to Esther, don't imagine that of all the Jews, you will escape your life by being in the king's palace. If you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another place, mimakom acher, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained the royal position just for this crisis. This is a very interesting verse. Here you can see that the narrative purposely does not want to mention the name of God. This would be an opportune place for Mordechai would say, if you don't save us, God has many messengers, right? I mean, it seems like an obvious thing to say, but the narrative purposely is always leaving out God's name, no matter what. And I mentioned this already when we talked about the introduction to the. And then Esther answers back to Mordechai. Assemble all the Jews in Shushan. Let them fast on my behalf. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night and day. By the way, the Beta Yisrael, our Ethiopian brethren, have a tradition to fast for 3 days, which they call the fast of Esther. We do, of course, do it only 1 day, morning to evening, but their tradition was 3 days based on the story of Esther. I and my maidens will observe the same fast, and I shall go to the king, even though it's contrary to the law, and if I perish, I shall perish. In other words, I'm willing to do this, even though I might be throwing my life away, but Mordechai, if you think this is what I have to do, I'll do it. So Mordechai went about and did just as Esther had commanded. And in the end, what we'll see paid off was the fact that Mordechai told Esther, never tell that you're a Jew. This is going to be leverage, which Esther is going to use. Let's keep reading. On the third day, Esther put on the royal apparel. She stood in the inner court of the king's palace, facing the king's palace while the king was sitting in his royal throne. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor. The king extended to Esther the royal scepter, which had been in his hand, and Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. What do you think is going on in the king's head right now? Remember, Achashverosh, according to my argument, is a clever fellow. He knows what to do to keep his kingdom going. And now he sees Esther standing there in the courtyard. What did Esther just do?
She broke some laws.
I didn't hear. I'm sorry?
She broke the law.
Yes, but even more than this. Actually, she didn't yet break the law. He can still extend the scepter. But what is she actually doing?
He must have a good reason. So he wants to know.
Yes, because, keep going. What could possibly the result be of her action now?
It will be quite exceptional, for sure.
She can
I'm
be
sorry?
killed.
What?
She can be killed.
Exactly, she's risking her life. Now, why would somebody risk their life unless it's really, really important? I mean, she's got everything. She's the queen, she's got her own little palace, she's got everything she needs, and out of the blue, she's risking her life. She knows what the law is. What's going on? She knows she would eventually see me anyhow. Why is she risking her life? That's the first thing that's going through his head. Now, he wants to know. He puts out the scepter.
She trusts
He wants to
God.
know right now. I'm sorry? So basically, the first thing the king's mind is, this woman is risking her life. I need to know what's going on here. What troubles you, Queen Esther? Okay, now we understand the meaning of this question. What troubles you? Something must really trouble you. You just risked your life, and I just saved your life. So what really is going on? What's your request? Obviously, something really important. As you know, up to half the kingdom will be granted to you. The Talmud, of course, again gets back to its narrative of Achashverosh being anti the Jews going to Israel, and they say, what's half the kingdom? Anything but Jerusalem. So, half the kingdom. Okay, the Talmudic narrative is sometimes what I call it a superimposed narrative on the Megillah, because they're also trying to make a point. It's not always necessarily the exact narrative of the Megillah, but that's a discussion by itself. What troubles you, Esther, the king said. What is your request? Because obviously, I'm going to add, you just risked your life. What's going on? If it pleases your majesty, Esther replied, let your majesty and Haman come together to a feast I have prepared for him. Now you have to understand, the king is totally in shock. Okay? He's trying to be nice. He realized, and he knows that Esther knows that she risked her life. And he knows that she knows that he knows that she risked her life. And so obviously it's something really, really important. And now what's Esther's answer? Oh, I just want to invite you to a party, you and Haman, so we could get together. And Achashverosh is thinking, no, that's not what she wants, right? That's quite obvious. So he's perplexed at this point. Right away, we can see that Esther has a plan. And the plan starts from chapter 5, and it continues all the way into chapter 9. From 5 to 9, half this book is going to be all about Esther's plan. As I told you, the book is called after Esther, not Mordechai. This is the Persian femme fatale who's able to manipulate the situation. Esther has a plan, and it is ingenious. But we're coming towards the end of our time, so I might have to push it off to next week. What I want to show you is there's really, and I mean, Esther must have been a very clever woman, because the plan is really ingenious. And I'm not even going to tell you anything about it, but I'll show you how it develops from chapter 5 all the way to chapter 9. And it works like a chess game, okay? Every piece is planned out, and we'll see how every move was planned in order to remove Haman from power. That's basically what I'm going to show. And Ahasuerus realizes that. Actually, he doesn't 100% realize what she does, because he doesn't realize the manipulation. He only realizes the outcome. But it'll be a brilliant plan of manipulation, almost like one of these whodunit, Agatha Christie, something like that. And that's really what's going to happen from now to chapter 9. And then, of course, and all the Jews are jubilant. But again, this is going to be the woman who's going to manipulate the whole thing, and it has nothing to do with Mordechai. Mordechai just told her she's got to do something, but now she is taking over. She is now going to be, from now to the end, this very bashful, shy woman who didn't want to go to the king's beauty contest, who didn't really want anything from Shashgaz, who was giving her all these cosmetics whenever, and seemed to be, and the Talmud calls her karka olam, she just went along with whatever, and whatever Mordechai told her to do, she did. All of a sudden, she is blossoming, and she's now becoming the protagonist and the hero of this story, and she's going to be a major manipulator who's now figured out the whole political scenery of the palace and exactly figured out what to do by this point. Okay, that will be next week. So I wish everybody in the meantime a happy Purim.